This treatise attempts to answer the question, will America cross the line and attack Iran? There are uncanny parallels between an ancient Hebrew end-of-time prophecy and current world events. The first part of the prophecy appears to implicate the devastation of Iraq, but then there is an even bigger implication for a Western power attacking Iran, with resultant worldwide chaos. Taken that these prophecies were actually directed at Babylon and Persia, now known as Iraq and Iran, and that these prophecies talked about a build-up of last-day events, is there any way of stopping them, or is it predestined? Will the President of the United States listen? Intelligence suggests we are set on an unstoppable course of a matter of time that matters. Even New Zealand Investigate magazine runs a cover story about an American game plan to attack Iran. An American historian, scholar, and author makes unnerving, in-depth study and uncovers information to support it. American author and acclaimed speaker Charles Wheeling has not so much come to tell us about rocks falling from the skies, or polar caps melting, or uncontrollable worldwide disease. Charles is in New Zealand to tell us of prophetic events leading to this, where it will begin, and how the world will end because of it. Strong words. Necessarily, he relies on old Hebrew prophecy contained in the Bible book of Daniel and amplified by the book of Revelation. There have been many attempts at interpreting these books, which talk of strong, fearsome beasts and animals, and many vehemently believe they have the correct formula. Dating back as far as AD 37, Flavius Josephus, a well-known Jewish historian, has records of attempts by Hebrew interpreters to decipher and apply Daniel's visions to events that occurred more than 2,000 years ago. Here in Tauranga, New Zealand today, just out of a suburb of Bethlehem, named after the birthplace of Jesus, Charles tells a gathered group.
And they thought 2,000 years ago that the end of the world was at hand. And why did they think that? Because Jesus had come and Jesus had died and Jesus was resurrected. And Jesus told them, I'm going to heaven and I'm coming back. And they assumed, every one of them, without exception, very clear, you just read it, they assumed that he was coming back right away. So people had been believing that Jesus was going to come back, and people have been believing that the world was going to end for thousands of years.
Take, for example, the rapture concept. Rapture, derived from the Latin word rapere, meaning to take away or to snatch out. Biblical text relating to this is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. Because the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a commanding call, and those who are dead in union with Christ will rise first. Afterwards, we the living who are surviving will, together with them, be caught away in clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. There are people like Hal Lindsey, Edgar Weisnort, Peter Ruckman, who had thought rapture should have occurred many years ago. Born-again Christians, both living and dead, should have actually experienced a mass migration and rise into the heavens towards Jesus. Then, the founder of Jehovah's Witness estimated Armageddon would be in 1914. When nothing happened, these target dates were reset several times to 1918, then 1920, 1925, 1941, 1957, 1975, and 1994. Armageddon is supposedly the prophetic final war that will end the world. It is a Greek word derived from the Hebrew name of a place called Har Megiddo, a fortified hill city in northern Palestine. the supposed site of this great battle between forces of good and evil, leading to God's final judgment. Others, however, say the climatic war would be in Jerusalem. More predictions for the Armageddon were in 1986, when it was said Russia would defeat Israel and the US and establish worldwide dictatorship. This would have been followed by the second coming of Christ in 1993, after 7 years of cruelty, hardship and suffering that should have followed that great war. Still, another intriguing story of would-be end times is mentioned in an article in the Atlantic magazine, which comments on how Herbert W. Armstrong's empire, the Church of God, suffered a serious blow when the end failed to begin in January 1972, as he predicted, thus bringing hardship to many people who had given most of their assets to the church in expectation of going to Petra, the place of peace and safety, where such worldly possessions would be useless. Where is all this leading to? There are just too many end-time predictions that have never gone right. There seems to be a problem with trying to predict exact dates for this to happen, yet those that do seem to be so sure of themselves, and everyone wants to impress on everyone else their beliefs. It might help to reflect on Mark Twain's saying, "What gets us into trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so." However, Charles Wheeling has a different perspective in that he doesn't claim to be predicting exactly when end times will occur. More than anything, he wants to promote awareness of events that will lead up to it. While his interpretations seem to have a far more sound basis, he was shocked by severe judgment from his church, the Seventh-day Adventists in Alabama, USA, who disfellowshipped him for his radical opinions. He went against their agreed panel interpretation of prophecy, which seemed tailor-made to place them and their own beginnings as part of the prophecy, as the remnant chosen people. At that time, he was serving the ministry as a literature evangelist. The church set out to burn the books he published entitled America in Prophecy, and a campaign was set out to discredit him. It was not clearly understood why this had to happen to Charles. It appeared that most of what got him into trouble was his earnest desire to share with the world his prophetic outlook based not only on past historic events, but weighing more heavily in terms of current and future events. The reason being, the books of Daniel and Revelation actually discuss end-time events, which can certainly only occur in the future. And when it comes to end time, you can only be right once.
What right would you and I have to come here this evening and suppose or think or assume that, well, the world's about to end? Okay? And I don't mind telling you, I am assuming and I am supposing and I am proposing that the world's about to end. And I want to tell you upon what I base my views. Okay? That's what I want to share with you.
Are end time stories interesting? If you meet interesting people who have original ideas about them, they do become interesting. But for being different in its beliefs about what the Bible books of Daniel and Revelation portray as events relevant to the end of the world, Charles was soon discredited by his church, the Seventh-day Adventists. Even then, Ellen White, who helped establish the Seventh-day Adventists and later considered their prophet, had also made numerous end-time predictions for the 1850s. Yet all her predictions failed. Another prominent end-times movement, known as Millerism, or the Millerite movement, was founded by William Miller. He determined that the second coming would happen sometime between 1843 and 1844. The prior occurrence of a spectacular meteor shower gave his movement a good push forward. People then sold their possessions, dressed in white robes, and gathered on the side of a mountain, singing hymns, and waited to be lifted into the heavens. The build-up of anticipation continued until Miller's timetable ran out. The movement collapsed. Yet, out of it, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was founded. They deemed themselves the remnant people with all the answers to end-time prophecy. Another group, the Mormons, had declared the end would be before 1991. What about the Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists? The source and variety of end-world predictions seem endless. In the years after 1346, the Black Plague killed a third of Europe's population. This eerie death toll was thought to be a prelude to the end of the world. You will be amazed that not only religious groups, but even scientists had made such predictions. Like when the Jupiter effect in 1982, which referred to the aligning of various planets on the same side of the Sun, was thought to bring about the end. This aligning would create tidal waves, solar flares, rain and temperature disturbances, massive earthquakes, and radio interruptions. Yes, the planets did align, but that was all there was to it. All these stories make for more skeptics around the world. Therefore, any such talk, like what is contained in Charles Wheeling's message, may be ignored. Many will turn deaf ears to it and will go on with life as before. Yet still, thousands all over the world have been captivated by Mr. Wheeling's seminars, having addressed audiences across the US, Canada, the Caribbean, Europe, Australia, and now New Zealand. Many are awed in disbelief at his predictions almost 30 years ago are seeing reality today, piece by piece. Here in New Zealand, he is on a tour to expound his message of a matter of time that matters. Visiting Hell's Gate, just out of Rotorua, one of the country's famed tourist spots, we noticed Charles contemplating the burning heat of boiling mud pools, erupting geysers, and unnerving swirls of hot steaming fumaroles. That's nothing compared to the real thing. We later discover that his is a message not of doom, but rather of hope. As early as 1981, he was predicting that America would attack Iraq. 10 years later, Desert Storm was undertaken swiftly. And while Charles' predictions did not mention the year it would occur, he did exactly specify the countries involved. 22 years later also saw the US-led coalition against Iraq that toppled the Hussein regime. And where did he base his prophetic wisdom? Like many who have made attempts before him, the Bible books of Daniel and Revelation have been his raw material, along with significant bits and pieces from other parts of the Bible.
One of the things that I learned many years ago when I began speaking to large groups of people is that you have to be very careful, because a word means one thing to this person and may mean something quite different to the person next to them. And so we try to get some definitions, try to get some things together so that at least we're trying to think along the same track and maybe, hopefully, prayerfully arrive at some of the same conclusions.
Some of the people who gave us the Bible we refer to as prophets. This gives you the image of people who are foretelling the future, yet most of it is actually forthtelling. These things were written beforehand, but they were really written for us.
It's God's person speaking to the present generation, giving them instruction for the present time. And when we look at it, we begin to see that there are hints and there are things hidden in there that really are prophetic. That is, they reach down, down, down. Though the person writing it at the time and the person reading at the time didn't see it that way at all.
We recall that one fair day, the disciples were with Jesus at Mount of Olives. They remarked at the majesty of the temple that Herod had rebuilt in Jerusalem, which they had just visited. Indeed, even King Caesar of Rome had sent beautiful marble blocks to Herod to help rebuild that temple. Would you believe Jesus' reply was as serious as to say that what you see, the day is coming when not one stone, not one, will be left standing one on top of another. This would be Jesus' way of describing the time of the end. Who would not be taken aback in fear and panic at such a story? Only a disastrous catastrophe or a war of monstrous magnitude could be capable of such destruction. The disciples cringe at the thought. When the Great Roman War of 70 AD destroyed this very same temple in Jerusalem, thousands actually believed Jesus' prophecy had been fulfilled, that time actually marked the beginning of the end.
But it was not a fulfillment. Why not? Because there are stones still standing atop one another from that temple on that day. And something has to happen. Either that or the Bible doesn't really speak as it reads and Jesus didn't really mean what he said. And I take the Bible as it reads, as best I can. And that's what I would like to encourage you to do. So the disciples said, see the temple, see the great stones. Jesus said, the day's coming, and they said, that must be the end of the world. Tell us how we can know when the end of the world is coming and when you're coming back. So he talked about signs.
The disciples cringed in fear and panic when Jesus told them that day would come when not one stone will be left standing in the glorious temple of Jerusalem. They knew that only a disastrous catastrophe or war of monstrous magnitude could be capable of such destruction. They knew it would herald the time of the end. They asked Jesus, would there be signs then before such occurrences in order that they could prepare themselves? The story of signs and symbols are there for the world to decipher. The raw material in the Old Testament book Daniel, further detailed in the New Testament book Revelation, tell many a startling tale, believe it or not.
The disciples said, that must be the end of the world. Tell us how we can know it. And lo and behold, Jesus quotes Daniel. And when he says in his conversation with them, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, all you have to do is keep going in Daniel's visions. It's this character right here. When you therefore shall see, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, whoever reads it, let him understand. And if you're in Judea, get out of town. And if you're in Jerusalem, get out of town. Don't take time to pack your suitcase. Don't take time to say hello, goodbye. Get out of town. That means something big, bad, and ugly is about to happen.
It is known hundreds of centuries ago, in about 605 BC, the then world superpower Babylon was determined to conquer the then second world superpower Egypt. In so doing, they had to cross through Judea, trampling it and completely destroying its capital city of Jerusalem. A youth named Daniel was among those captives, a prisoner of war, you might say.
Daniel was taken all the way over to Babylon, and he was being tested like many of those people who were taken captive to see what are your talents, what are your abilities, and so forth. And Daniel was a bright young man. And it was decided that he was going to go into the schools of the wise men. He was going to be educated in the ways of Babylon. And that's how Daniel got there. A teenager, a Hebrew, and a captive in a foreign land.
Daniel became a trusted advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar, having been discovered to possess a unique ability to interpret, with much accuracy, the king's troubling dreams.
And God gave him not only the dream of the king, but gave him the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar recognized the dream and recognized that the interpretation was valid.
Thus Daniel became an important figure in Babylonian government, serving a succession of kings.
Daniel were 13, 14, 15 years of age when he was taken captive, and he is almost at the end of the 70 years and studying the prophecies of Jeremiah and praying about them in Daniel chapter 9. Then he must have been well into his 80s, maybe 85. Daniel never came home. However, while he was there in Babylon, God, in his wisdom, chose to give Daniel visions of the time of the end, it says in the Bible. The end of time and the end of the world.
No one likes nightmares, but if you were Daniel, you'd think you just had a nightmare after the first dream. In the beginning, he sees 4 winds blowing upon and across the great sea. The waters become turbulent or troubled. Now, when you say wind in the Bible, it means war, whereas waters means people, multitudes, nations, tongues or different languages.
And this is not just a few people. This is a lot of people upset, troubled.
So there will be, or already is, a war, or 4 subsequent wars. The people of the world become agitated, disturbed, worried. Then the nightmare continues with 4 weird-looking beasts coming out of the waters.
So the angel tells Daniel in his vision that these beasts represent kings or kingdoms, nations. This is the idea.
The first beast that arises is actually a lion, but it has wings. Not just any pair of wings. It has the wings of an eagle.
And I'm going to ask you, if someone came to you with symbolism and said, is there any power on the planet today that has anything to do with an eagle? You'd say straight away, you should, the United States of America, because that is the official emblem of the nation. And what about a lion? That's Great Britain. Check it out. Not making anything up.
As the lion rose out of the water, something happens to it to make it weak or humbled, is how Daniel describes it.
This number one is humbled. How do we see that in the vision? Thank you. How do we see that in the vision? Well, the lion has eagle's wings, and it tells you that the wings are pulled off. And it tells you that his lion's heart is pulled out and a man's heart is given to him.
When such world powers as we know them today begin a decline, it seems a natural consequence that the whole world will suffer as a result of a chain of reaction of economic collapse.
You say, well, not going to bother us down here. Well, if the lion and eagle are humbled, and you keep reading in Daniel's visions and you read what Jesus told the disciples in this conversation, what's going to happen is the United States of America is going to go bankrupt. All the stock markets of the world are going to go this overnight. Overnight. And if you think it's not going to affect you way down here, you better think again.
After that first world power is weakened or fallen, what happens next in Daniel's nightmare? Daniel has 4 dreams. The first is like a nightmare. full of fearsome beasts. A lion with eagle's wings coming out of waters that were troubled by winds. As it rises, its wings are plucked out and a man's heart is given it. Briefly interpreted, the United States and Great Britain together represent this beast. They rise to world power but are subsequently humbled or weakened. This theoretically leaves the world without a superpower.
Nature hates a vacuum, especially a power vacuum. And there arises in the vision a bear. And he is not being humbled, he is rising. He is strengthening.
The second beast arising, the bear, is actually symbolic of Russia, a nation which will increase in power after the weakening of the United States and Great Britain. In his dream, Daniel sees that the bear devours much flesh, obviously referring to this rise in Russian strength and influence.
The Russians have tried a new way to penetrate British airspace with their fleet of nuclear bombers. Having failed to sneak past the fighter jets of the British Air Force, the Russians have done the next best thing: let British TV reporters into a Russian bomber base to beam the threat back to the target. ITV's Robert Moore was one of them.
The Russians took us to their main strategic bomber base by train, 16 hours from Moscow, and then by bus. A unique glimpse into one of the most secretive corners of the country. The heavy bombers, designed to launch nuclear missiles against Western targets in the event of war, were lined up along the runway. For 50 years, they've tried to keep everything here a secret, until now. We were invited in to see this. The Tupolev 160, Russia's long-range bomber. The pilots call it the White Swan. NATO uses the code name Blackjack, and it's a